go in on a full tank, be ready to articulate the other side in the most charitable way possible, be ready to set aside the conversation for a while to go do some further reading and thinking and praying.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Mike Cosper, and today on our show, John Inazu joins us to talk about civility in an election year. Russell Moore and I have a conversation about why it feels like anything could break at any moment. And David Bahnsen stops by to talk about Bernie Sanders and the 4-day work week.
Welcome back to The Bulletin. I get different kinds of questions, and I'm sure Mike and Nicole do too, in different contexts. College students will usually ask about practical spiritual disciplines and assurance of salvation questions and things like that. Bookish people will ask about books. Tech-oriented people will ask about AI. But one question comes up in every conversation, everywhere, doesn't matter the group, doesn't matter the place, and that is, how do we get through 2024? And what usually people mean by that is all of the division and the polarization and the broken relationships. How do we disagree? This week, we have with us one of the experts on that who has a new book. John Inazu, professor of law at Washington University in St. Louis, is the author of Learning to Disagree, The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect. And this book is not only worth buying because of John Inazu and his writing, but there are illustrations by John Hendricks, who also did the illustrations, if you've not seen this, The Faithful Spy, which is a graphic novel about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's amazing. So both of them are amazing, and the book is really worth your time. John, thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with all of you.
So you have a church small group. A third of them are MAGA. A third of them are Biden supporters. A third of them are just unsure, and they're trying to hide. How do they stay together, and should they?
Oh, first of all, I'd like to take their pastor out for a drink. But I think setting aside some important line drawing questions, and I think there are some ecclesially and organizationally, but if everyone's in it together, if everyone's committed to a common purpose, then they have to prioritize the relationships.
So how do you do that? In terms of you come in, you're sitting down, everybody's tense. Do you avoid the subject and agree to avoid it? Do you say, let's work all this out first before we do our study of Philemon, or what do you do?
I love the question, but I don't think it's generalizable. Right? Let's start with who the small group is. If they're in personal crisis, focus on the person who needs help. If they're sort of deficient in scripture, then start there. But if they're at a place where they're ready to have healthy conversation, then I think don't avoid this at all costs. We have to be talking about our deep differences and our deep convictions. And once that relationship of trust is established, then go for it. And there are smart ways to do this. Go in on a full tank, be ready to articulate the other side in the most charitable way possible. Be ready to set aside the conversation for a while to go do some further reading and thinking and praying. And over time, I've seen this happen. It's possible, and I want it to be possible in these small groups too.
One of the things that I think a lot about whenever this subject comes up is how difficult what you just described actually is. Frankly, that feels like 99% of the problem is, can we charitably understand where someone else is coming from? Shortly after the 2016 election, I remember having a conversation with somebody about the Trump voters. And, this person was essentially saying, I just can't understand how anybody would make this decision, et cetera, et cetera. And they were giving the laundry list of accusations that are very common that you hear from, particularly this was a person of the left. But as we were talking, I said, when I talk to my friends who voted Trump, here are some of the things that come up in terms of economic grievances of the white working class and this, that, and the other. And it was amazing how quickly the conversation went from talking about other people to talking about me as an apologist for white supremacists. Because it was very difficult for this person to have not just empathy for the Trump voter who was saying, look, my life is really unhappy and what he's saying makes sense to me, and so I'm going to go there. But to even give credence to that being a worldview was bringing out anger and vitriol and became a very heated conversation. So even that first step of getting to the point where we can say, I can comprehend how someone in good faith could make a decision other than mine, feels like a gulf that I don't even know how we begin to bridge that one.
What that brings up for me, Mike, is that we do, in some humility, can start by recognizing how our own positions and views, especially about complicated issues, are as much norms and values as they are facts. And a lot of people out there want to start by saying, I'm right, you're wrong, I've got the facts and you don't. Now, this is complicated today because some people are just denying facts, right? Some people are going to argue about what the day of the week is, and we shouldn't let those distract us. But it's important to say what candidate I'm voting for, my views about a certain policy or law, my thoughts on what happened during COVID. All of those things are immensely complicated questions with lots of norms and values and judgments interspersed with some factual claims, and trying to sort through that mess to figure out what someone actually believes in the most charitable way takes a lot of work, and it's not going to be shortcutted with assertions and accusations.
In 2020, I read this life-changing article from Good Housekeeping magazine. It was talking about how physiologically it is difficult to empathize when you're under stress. The idea is a part of your brain that feels empathy, the ability to understand where other people are coming from and how they feel. The oxygen shuts off to that part of the brain when you're under stress, and it feeds your fight or flight. So when you think about politics and this beautiful setup of this beautiful small group, you think about the fact that when people start to talk politics, they start to talk about their lives, like you said, John, their values, and then their stress levels go up because the narrative is, if my candidate doesn't get in, if my issues are not forefront, I will die. Our country is going to hell. Everything is going to break loose. It's going to be awful. So my stress is rising while I'm thinking about, you can't possibly think that way. And it's physiologically impossible for me to have empathy with you when I have a fear that the world is going to hell. How do we really have empathy that Mike's talking about to hear what somebody else is saying and what they believe, when deep down the fear is, if your beliefs win out, I lose. My family loses. I lose, fill in the blank, something very dear to me. And in most cases, I would suggest the biggest fear is a loss of power. I don't know how to reconcile that, even in the midst of a Bible study.
We know there is a line. So we're not going to say, let's understand where the Ku Klux Klan is coming from, but you have to hand it to Stalin. You can't do that. So there is some line here where you would say, this kind of position means that we're just not going to be able to relate to each other, right? And even there are some practical things where you just can't work together. How do you know where that line ought to be, though?
I think there's some discernment and judgment, and also recognizing that this is somewhat contextual. 100 years ago, people equated polygamy to human sacrifice. And I think culturally we think about those two things. We can still say they're both wrong. We can still say that they're outside of the Christian faith, but they're not going to be equivalent in terms of the harms that we see. But part of this discernment, and this goes back to Nicole's point, which I thought, I don't usually find myself in alignment with Good Housekeeping, but here I think this is a very apt comparison. The book, in a nutshell, is a pitch to the reader to say this is law school for everyone, because in law school, this is exactly the kind of stuff we teach. I want my students, when they hear that really shrill perspective or that really hard issue, to be able to filter it against their physiological responses and to be able to say, I need in this moment to ask good questions, to push hard on prior premises, to situate my emotions so that I can be professional and calm and measured about it. And that's not a human skill that's just innate in us. We got to work at it. And I'm trying to suggest that peeking into what we do in law school is one way for people to do this around the dinner table or at the workplace in very ordinary settings.
Yeah, you talk about in the book procedure and using this imagery from law and from the courtroom. There's an agreed upon way to work through things. How does one do that in, say, a family? You have to have a hard conversation about, is it time to put mom in a home or something like that? How do you sort of set the ground rules ahead of time? One of us might win out, one of us might lose, but we're going to abide by the decision.
And that example is so poignant too. You have to build the trust prior to the hard conversations. So one thing I often say is don't start with family. Practice this, get good at it aside from family, because family is going to be the highest stakes. But when you get to those family discussions, make sure that you've built in the trust so that the procedure can also be trusted. You're not going to trust procedure if you set it up for the first time in a moment of crisis. And you have to know what your purpose as a group is. What's the purpose of this family? What's the purpose of this church? What's the purpose of this school? If you know that, then you can build trust in the procedure. If you don't know what you're about, it's going to be very hard to bring people along with the procedural process.
As long as I've been alive, I've always heard this is the most important election in our lifetime, right? And of course, everyone is saying that now. This is certainly a unique election for all kinds of reasons. But do you feel like there's some recency bias around the urgency, or do you think that our circumstances are different and that the polarization is different now than it was before?
Yeah, great question. I think it's really important to sort of name that recency bias. I keep hearing we're as polarized as we've ever been. I don't think that's true. I mean, look back not just to the Civil War, but also to the 1960s and the 1920s, the election of 1800. We can come up with countless examples where there was a lot of vitriol and a lot of violence in ways that we're not seeing today. I also think that some of the heated rhetoric talks about the end of democracy the day after the election. That's just not going to happen. But we can be worried with good measure. We can express concerns. We can be engaged in politics, and we can vote without overclaiming in the rhetoric. Having said that, I am worried about where we're headed with social media and AI and algorithms, particularly around the coming election. And when you think about how things can spread virally in a matter of hours, let's say a couple hours before the polls close, we need to have built up, especially at the local level, a measure of trust in institutions and in leaders who can hold the line for a bit and say, let's wait half a day before we overreact. And so I think the answer is a mixed bag. We're not as polarized as we've ever been, but we are encountering new technologies and new modes of communication that are going to greatly complicate things for us.
This idea of trust is really intriguing to me, especially given the Gallup polls for last year that basically said that pastors are among the bottom third of people to be trusted, and they were right next to politicians. So if there is no institutional trust, and there's not really a lot of trust in leaders, where do you build a foundation of trust for what is likely to be really contentious conversations, at the very least, in the fall?
I think we have no other choice but to work hard at local institutions. And if it's not a functional or healthy church, then start with your neighborhood or your block or your local school. I think colleges and universities and secondary schools have a big role to play here. But work on the ordinary trust building now before, back to Russell's analogy of the family crisis moment. We are probably going to have some family crisis moments in our polity in November. So don't wait until then to start the ordinary trust building. Start inviting people over for dinner and having lots of social time if you don't know the people around you.
There's such a differential in psychologies. I've talked to people who have worked in elections, at the polls, in their communities all their lives. They're not doing it now because of threats of physical violence or legal strategies to intimidate them. They just won't do it. And if you've got one group of people who will say, let's try to understand each other, but another group of people who are saying, you're the enemy who must be destroyed, that's a mismatch. How do you try to figure out how to recalibrate it?
Yeah, I mean, as a very pragmatic point, when you get to the point of thinking you are the enemy, you are evil, you must be destroyed, that does not lead us to good places. And you're right, that's out there in the public discourse. It's growing. I think the best we can do is hope, pray, and work. That doesn't creep past the edges. But I also think, as a very functional point, most of us work and play and eat with people who we think hold very awful and immoral and harmful ideas. And we don't see that as the totality of who they are. And it's how we get along in the world. And I think we need to remind each other that this is happening all the time in very ordinary spaces. We don't feel it on social media, but we live it in most of our lives. And that's a place we've got to start. You're right that at the fringes, there are people who just aren't going to come into our ordinary social circles, probably in both directions. But I want to go back to where Russell started the conversation, which was the hypothetical small group. And maybe that third layout is not representative, but in our churches and in our schools, we do actually have quite a bit more ideological diversity in many cases than we actually know. And one of the challenges is we're not actually having the conversations to demonstrate to each other that we are quite different. So I think there are ways to do this. I think, Russell, the curriculum that you all are working on with the after party is a good example here. I find in my own experience when I'm able to teach a seminar, it's not going to work in a 100-person class. When I have a seminar of 12 or 15 students, over the course of a semester, we can actually start to get real about some of our beliefs and our differences. And when we can facilitate those conversations through common readings and common discussions over time, it's pretty wonderful. And I have students say things like, this is why I came to college. Why did it take so long to have this experience? And I think we can all work to create more of those in our churches and in our schools and associations.
And it seems like it's often not the massive differences that create the tensions and divisions in our communities, especially in our churches, because like we said, like you've already had this kind of ideological sorting has happened a long time ago. It's those small differences that create those volatile divisions. And it seems to me like part of what you're talking about too is the temptation is when the eruptions happen around these conflicts to run away from them or to diffuse them as quickly as possible and get people to their separate corners and go, well, let's just make sure we never talk about that again. Where what's necessary is pressing in some ways, finding a healthy way to say, how do we de-escalate but continue the conversation? Am I reading that right?
I think that's part of it. And the other piece I would add to this is a bit of grace with one another. So I think, especially in church and denominational settings, when you have a split, that's really painful. And part of it is this loss of trust where you think, I thought we were on the same page. And actually, we're very divided over this important issue. And the issue remains important. This is actually a super critical point. This is not a case for relativism. That divide matters. And there's going to be a right and a wrong answer in the fullness of time to that theological question. But the way that we treat each other across that difference also matters. After a split of that kind, when the next words out of our mouth are, you're evil or you're a monster, that's not a very healthy display of Christian witness.
All right. So get your small groups ready. 2024 is here. The book is Learning to Disagree by John Anazu. John, thanks for being with us.
All right, we are back, Russell and I, here together again. So before we get into the discussion today, I wanted to just take a second. You talked to Jonathan Haidt this week, and that episode is up. If listeners want to go and check it out, I wanted to highlight it, and I wanted to ask you a question about it because I think the work that he's doing is so important, and I think that conversation was extraordinary. Was there anything in particular that stuck out to you after that conversation, knowing his work, knowing his research? Do you find any of it surprising at this point?
He has demonstrated in this book how mental health decline correlates perfectly with the rise of smartphones among adolescents. And not only that, the thing that was surprising is I brought up the question, isn't it true that people said this about television? They said this about radio before that it would harm us. And he said, yeah, the difference is that the people watching television weren't saying that this is doing this to me. And it is the kids themselves are saying this is the problem. I think the thing that I've been thinking about ever since that conversation is, of course, John's an atheist. He's very intrigued by religious people, but isn't one. I really pressed him about smartphones in worship. And he said, you should have churches that voluntarily people surrender their technology. And I just keep thinking, yeah, but how would that work? Maybe there's a church somewhere that has actually successfully done that, but I can't imagine it. I haven't seen it.
It's funny you say that. I talked to somebody who was involved in church marketing for a long time and was tied to some very successful churches. And they've been out of that business for a while. And I said, if you were going to jump in now, because they helped create this sort of tech curve of the modern megachurch, what would you do? And he laughed at first and he was like, oh man, I don't even know where I'd begin. Everything's tech now, everything's this. And then instantly he goes, honestly, it would be stripping as much of the branding and technology out of the room as possible. Create an experience where people walk in the door and they know they're not supposed to use their phones and you don't have a bunch of screens and it's something that only happens once while you're in the room and then you leave and all you can do is talk about it. That's the experience that I would create. That's the counterculture experience that I think people would crave right now.
I think that's actually right. I think that's true.
The data isn't lying in terms of what does it mean to be a human being, and how does this dehumanizing technology have a profound and terrible impact on the soul?
I'm afraid we're going to look back 5 years from now and say, oh, how quaint that was that they were worried about smartphones when what was around the corner was worse. And how do you prepare people for those sorts of scenarios when they can't imagine what the technology is actually going to be in their own lives?
No. From one doomsday scenario to another, it feels like everything is right on the verge of breaking, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at the House of Representatives, you've had this GOP majority for the last couple of years. Mike Gallagher just left the House. One of the quote unquote adults in the room, Ken Buck, Kevin McCarthy have stepped down. And Marjorie Taylor Greene just introduced a motion because she doesn't like some things that the current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is doing to remove him as well. Mm-hmm. A couple months ago, we had the Her report about President Biden and his mental state. We've talked ad nauseum about some of the things we've seen with President Trump in terms of both sort of his mental state, the kinds of people he wants to bring in, the legal troubles that he's in. Nothing feels stable right now to me. Mm-hmm. Let's start with the House. Given your background and your work, I imagine you probably know Mike Johnson or have met Mike Johnson, have had some familiarity with his work. What do you think is going on in his office right now as he's trying to pass a budget, trying to fund 2 wars, and trying to deal with... First of all, no one ever thought he was going to be Speaker of the House anytime soon.
Yeah, Mike was a board member of the ERLC, my previous place, right before I got there. But he was a board member for many years and member of a Southern Baptist Church, active layman in that. I think that what's happening sort of across the board is that you've got a distinction between the people who actually have to do things and make things happen in the real world, and the people who are cosplaying for their audiences. And it's very difficult to put those two things together. So whatever somebody thinks of Mike Johnson or his politics or all that, put that to the side. He's got to do something. The planes have to take off in the Air Force. You have to do something to pass a budget and actually govern. You can't do that with this kind of world. And as you mentioned, the problem is, and this is happening in a lot of these institutions, not just in the Congress, the problem is the people who are the most stable and the most stabilizing are the ones who are leaving. And I don't know what the answer to that is in the short term.
And then you can expand outward. So just Easter Day, right? There were a lot of folks, including me, who had a negative reaction to, on Easter weekend, President Biden recognizing Trans Visibility Day. But then, while that's going on, you have on Truth Social, former President Donald Trump tweets, truths, whatever the verb is, "Happy Easter to all, including crooked and corrupt prosecutors and judges that are doing everything possible to interfere with the presidential election of 2024 and put me in prison, including those many people that I completely and totally despise because they want to destroy America, a now failing nation." Happy Easter, Mr. President, back to you as well. Again, you have this scenario where I think a lot of people, and this was my sentiment, and is you're looking at a situation where you're saying, man, I feel like I'm in this moral no man's land. So our institutions are destabilizing. I don't get a sense that help is on the way. When is Gandalf coming back to Rohan, and when is the light coming? It really does feel like it's getting worse, and it's getting worse faster.
And I think some of that just has to do with natural human psychology. We all, at some level, tend to think of ourselves as kids who have grown-ups somewhere out there in our lives, and when are they going to step in? And it takes a long time for people to realize, oh, wait, that's who I am now, and I have to do it. And coming back to Jonathan Haidt, part of the problem is this collective action problem where you think, okay, I know what technology is doing to my kids, but how do I fix it when everybody else is living in this world? And the same thing is true when it comes to all of these institutions and structures. If you are a grown-up, one grown-up isn't going to turn any of this around. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the problem. And people don't like it when you say that, because what they want is, oh, here is the simple 7-step way to get out of this. Or they want everything is going to totally collapse and Jesus comes. But what they don't want, and ultimately, yeah, everything does collapse and Jesus comes, and that might be next week, but it might be 3,000 years from now. The middle part is what's really difficult of saying, we're going to have some hard work here.
So let me push on something you said there, because I'm not sure I totally agree with you. When I think about where we are, part of what I lament is what feels like a lack of political imagination, right? I'm totally with you in the sense that I think a lot of people are sitting there. There's the collective action problem. There's inertia. There's all of this. But you had this moment in the late 70s in this country where there were all these problems. You had the Iran thing. You had the Cold War, going in the wrong direction. The economy was bad and all of this. And Reagan shows up with a different way of talking, a different kind of vision, a different approach. Like, he had political imagination. And there's a sense in which you can look at 2016 as a moment where whatever else you want to say about Donald Trump, the man had political imagination. He tapped into something other people could not have imagined was there, right?
Correct.
So what I feel like we've done, though, is that there was this pivot to then say, that is now the new normal, and now we're going to sort of re-embrace the inertia. This is just how it is. And so part of what's sad about seeing a figure like a Mike Gallagher or a Ben Sass or some of these other politicians who were thoughtful leaders, had reputations of integrity, had done some important things, written some important things, done important work, to see those folks who I could say, yeah, I could see them having the imagination to take us someplace new, going, I don't want any part of this. Is that like a white knight syndrome thing on my part? Like, I'm just waiting for Gandalf? Or have we closed off the possibility of something like that?
I don't think it's you're waiting for Gandalf, but I do think it misreads how much different the situation is right now from, say, 1979, 1980, where you had some institutions in crisis, but you didn't have seemingly every institution in crisis. You're right, there was a pivot point, and I do think people misunderstand how quickly things can actually change in some direction or the other. But usually the way that happens is by people losing in some way repeatedly until they say, wait, we have to do something else. You have this long span in the Democratic Party, George McGovern, Walter Mondale, Michael Dukakis, and you have people saying, wait, we can't just keep losing with these very far left Northeastern progressives, and they went with Bill Clinton. We're going to try something different. You've seen the same thing happen in the Republican Party as well. But usually that comes after some pain, or where somebody says, wait, we're losing. Right now, you're not going to ever have a 49-1 Reagan landslide like you did in 1984, or a 40-10 like you had in 1980. It's always going to be 51-49 for the foreseeable future. I don't know where the incentive structure is yet. It's not to say there can't be one, but I don't know where it is right now.
Yeah, and that's where I just keep coming back to this idea of when you look at history, it's like when you reach these moments of catastrophic inertia, that is the time when something new happens often. And I'm a big believer in the idea of like newness in politics. It's a good thing. It's an important thing. It's often not a chosen thing because it often happens because of disaster or war or the emergence of a demagogue or something like that. And the hope is that that's not how this gets solved. But it is surprising. The country's looking at a budget challenge, and it's looking at funding two wars, one which is very unpopular on the left, one which is very unpopular on a certain segment of the right, both which are generally popular with the country, 60+% or more with the country as a whole. Funding the budget is popular with the country as a whole. And because of where we are, the fringes of each party have an incredibly loud voice. And these very popular things are dying on the vine and killing political careers. Do you see that getting solved before November? Or do you think we're headed for a shutdown? Or do you think, is the war in Ukraine going to get funded? What are you thinking is going to happen with these issues hanging over our heads?
Well, I suspect that Ukraine is going to get funded. I suspect that's going to happen the same way that the government was funded last time, which is you have an act of bipartisanship that then destroys the person who does it. So that's the problem. And that's what did Kevin McCarthy in. You're not supposed to work with Democrats on something. And so I do think it gets done eventually. But the real question is going to be what happens 4 years from now. Because it's not just that the grown-ups are leaving. There's still some grown-ups there, but there aren't a lot of new ones showing up.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what really then one has to say, what happens then?
The reason the grown-ups don't show up is not because of the general elections, but because of the primaries.
Yeah.
The more radical, the more extreme, again, on the left and the right, the more radical, the more likely you are.
Right now, more on the
primary.
right than on the left in the electoral process. It's as much on the left and sometimes more in the cultural space. But in the electoral process, for instance, Jamal Bowman, congressman from New York, he's going to lose his primary because you have people who are saying, we don't want squad stuff. We really do want a normie there. So there are spaces where that's happening. What worries me is what a lot of the people who run for office or take institutional positions of leadership, they do so because they're inspired by or they're copying for a while somebody else. There was a long period of time where every young Democrat wanting to be elected to office would put his hand in his pocket the way JFK did, or would have some of the mannerisms of RFK, those kinds of things. And you had a generation where people were, I want to be on the right, I want to be Ronald Reagan. And then you had that emulation of that. What does that look like now? That's what worries me. I do think it has a shelf life because eventually people say this isn't sustainable. There's got to be a different way. What's the different way? But it's not pleasant between now and then.
Yeah. I think this kind of comes back to the Jonathan Haidt thing. So much of the Trump phenomenon was a social media phenomenon.
And a television phenomenon before that, reality television.
His entry into politics was the Obama birther conspiracy theory, which he really drove through Twitter. And then from Twitter, kind of pivoting onto Fox News and various places to propagate it. And so you see people, her fans hate when you compare the two, of course, but Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has cultivated a massive online following through similar performative online kind of habits and techniques. Matt Gaetz has said he does what he does as a representative to get on Fox News every night. And so playing to the camera, it means something different in this era than it's ever meant before, because that is the goal. That is the end in itself, rather than playing to the camera so that you can get certain legislative outcomes. I mean, at this point, it seems like the legislative outcomes are secondary. Gaetz and AOC are not famous for their policy initiatives.
What has been true in most of American history has been, at least in terms of Congress, you've always had showboaters. But you've had a group of people who say, okay, I'm Lee Hamilton from Indiana, and I'm going to study national security, international relations, and I'm going to know that. Mm-hmm. Or I'm somebody else. I'm going to study something, and I'm going to become an expert in that. There's not a lot of incentives for that.
Prior to 2016, Lindsey Graham on national security. He was phenomenal on those issues and reliable on them. So,
yeah, I remember having a conversation with Lindsey Graham in late 2016, early 2017. It was right after the Trump election. And we were talking about immigration issues. And he said, you know, it's no fun being screamed at by Rush Limbaugh on the air every day and being called Lindsey Grahamnesty, that sort of thing. And at the time, he was in a different sort of mode than he is now. But I think there is that dynamic at work where people, it's not so much that they're afraid of Rush Limbaugh or whatever the equivalent would be. It's that works on them. They don't want to have to deal with the screaming people at the town hall. I mean, to come back to Jonathan Haidt again, he talked about this problem with schools when it came to banning cell phones. So the problem is that parents call and scream. And I've had school administrators who've said that to me. I would love to do that. And I think the kids would actually love to do that. It's their parents who respond. And Jonathan's point was, yeah, but in almost every case, if you take a poll, 80% of the parents are going to back you up completely. The 20%, though, are going to be, they're the ones who call. Nobody calls to say, I think things are going pretty well.
Right.
And so that there has this effect of giving you this sense of, oh, everybody's after me. And so his suggestion when it came to schools is to say, hey, call if your administrators are doing the right thing, call and say so. And people just don't think to do that. They don't do that with their pastors. They don't do that with their members of Congress. And what I say to people is, and I had this conversation as recently as yesterday, when people say, what do we do? And my response is always to say, there's not something to do, there's just something to be. You can't really change the ecosystem of the church or the world or anything else, but what you can do is to say, okay, that's not the way to go. I'm going to be a different way. And over time, when enough people do that, because it sparks the imaginations of other people. Once you have somebody who's able to do that, you've got that responsible church member who actually is leading in a good direction and actually is moving toward something substantive and Christ-like, then people have a category in their mind to say, oh, I could be like that. I remember watching, there was a man in my home church, John Carver, who was chairman of deacons. And I think as a kid, looking at him and saying, that's the kind of person who ought to serve his church. Didn't mean I did everything when I grew up the way John Carver did, but it gave a kind of template in your mind. And that's what we need.
I agree. All right. We'll see what happens. Feels like it's all going to break. Something's going to break. Or maybe not. Maybe it just keeps going. We'll find out, and we will be right back. Last week, Bernie Sanders introduced an initiative to get the U.S. to adopt a 32-hour work week. This initiative would effectively cut the 5-day work week to 4, but, Senator Sanders says, companies couldn't reduce the pay or benefits of their employees. Anything over 32 hours would be considered overtime. He sees this as a plan that could be phased in over the next 4 years. Joining me to talk about this is David Bahnsen. David is the founder and managing partner of the Bahnsen Group, a bi-coastal private wealth management group. David is also a frequent contributor to CNBC, National Review, and Forbes. And he's the author most recently of Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life. David Bahnsen, welcome to the Bulletin.
It's wonderful to be with you, Mike.
Talk to me about this initiative from Senator Sanders. What is he after? What is an initiative like this trying to accomplish, as you see it?
I think in theory, he is a sincere believer that people are working too much and deserve to be paid more without having to work more. And I think it comes from his own worldview, which in the case of Bernie Sanders, he's one of the few people I would compliment this way. I think he's a true believer in this particular cause. It happens to be a cause I'm pretty vehemently opposed to. But I think he believes that laborers are victims of their bosses, that there is essentially a class divide, and that one of the ways that federal policy can help disintermediate that divide is things like a 32-hour work week, which really is sort of a backdoor way of controlling wages, but also controlling output. A heavier hand of government and economic activity towards an end that he believes is better for society.
He self-identifies as a socialist. In a lot of ways, this seems to reflect classic Marxist ideas about work. What does he imagine we're going to do with the extra 8 hours a week that have been given to us? I'm sure our listeners could go, well, there's a lot I could do with an extra 8 hours a week. But as a policy matter, what's someone like Senator Sanders thinking this is going to do for people? What opportunities is it going to provide?
I think that if I were to charitably quote him, I believe he believes it will help us to, if I could quote Karl Marx, do one thing today and another tomorrow, hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening. Marx talked romantically about this idea of free time liberating mankind. And I think that particularly someone like Bernie Sanders, who believes in sort of a labor theory of value, that the value of a particular good or service, the value of a business, of an enterprise, is essentially the labor that is imputed into it. And so that viewpoint, it is one that Marx held, and it's frankly one that even other free marketeers have wrongly held over the years as well.
Well, and so there's the economic theory, but there's also sort of the theory of meaning and purpose, right? Embedded in this is the idea that if you're working for someone else, inherently something is wrong. That work can't be as meaningful as working for yourself or doing something that you wanted to do. And again, I think the romanticism inside Marxism is such an important part of understanding it, that Marx really did think we would all be poets and philosophers if we sort of straightened out these economic issues. What do you see as inherently wrong with that vision?
I believe that almost all bad economics does come from some bad philosophy behind it. And generally, when I'm critical of economic policy, what I need to do is get down to the first principles that drive it. And in this case, not only is there a romanticism that is very Rousseauian and Marxian, but it's rooted in a flawed anthropology, a flawed view of the human person. I do not agree with Bernie Sanders that mankind was made to be in leisure and recreation, that mankind finds the good life when they find greater rest, relaxation, enjoyment, and so forth. I believe that there is such thing as a good life, and there is such thing as human flourishing. But for me to understand what human flourishing is, I have to know what I believe about the human person. And I believe about the human person that they were created by God to work. So this notion that we need to do mankind a favor by finding ways for them to work less, not only is it counterproductive as a policy front, what a 32-hour work week where you can't lower wages or benefits would do is increase unemployment. There's a maximum amount of work that can be done. That's the amount of hours in a day. I don't think anyone wants to work 168 hours a week or what have you. But there's also a minimum amount. That minimum is 0. And so by trying to force one number, you end up getting more of the other. And I think you would end up creating significant unemployment. But that is what's driving it, is their fundamental belief that mankind will receive more enjoyment from not working than from working. I happen to believe that God made mankind to be productive, to gain satisfaction from their productive work, to glorify Him, enjoy Him in these productive activities, which reflect our image-bearing status, mankind made in the image and likeness of God.
And this is very much at the heart of Full Time. So full disclosure, I read the book a couple months ago. I loved it for a couple of reasons. One was I appreciated reading it because of the perspective written by somebody who's coming to it from the marketplace. Part of what I think is so valuable in the vision of the book is that work is not a means to an end, the way that in a lot of faith and work teaching and writing, I find that work is sort of the means to an end. Do these things, build your company, build your wealth so that you can accomplish X, Y, and Z down the line with that wealth, giving it away or funding initiatives or whatever that might be, or because you're providing jobs for other people. But what you identify as something much more fundamental at the heart of work, the idea that work itself is an end in itself. Can you talk about that a little bit? What is it about work that is meaningful in itself?
I agree with all of those things as theoretical benefits. And in the case of providing and tithing, I even think they're commandments. But there's still transactional benefits from work that don't speak to the inherent, intrinsic dignity of the work. Where does the inherent intrinsic dignity of the work come from? It comes from the subject of the work, who is the worker. That God made mankind with an elevated dignity, and the part of this dignity is our capacity to cultivate the earth, to extract value from the created order. I'm very fond of John Frame's line that creation is what God gave us and culture is what we give back to Him. We create culture, we build civilization when we are producing the goods and services that enhance the quality of life for humanity. That's work. And we serve others through work. This was done in the Garden of Eden for us to take this beautiful garden that nevertheless was exposed to the conditions of scarcity. There was not infinite amounts of vegetation, of goods and services. Mankind had to go create these things. These artifacts of our own creation are beautiful things. They're not to be dreaded. They're not to be resented. They're not to be incorporated into a class struggle, a view of the world. And the reason I believe work has much more meaning than merely the paycheck and the tithing it might generate is that I believe in doing these things, we are living out our very existential purpose, what God made us to do. And not some of us, not just Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, not just corner office finance people, but all of us were made with dignity. And this view of the world now that about half of us are pretty productive and then half of us, it's okay if we just sort of consume, I think it's very elitist. And I think it's very sectarian, but I also think it's very atheistic. It does not acknowledge what the God of the universe created us to do.
It's interesting you use the word scarcity because I think of that sort of abundance and scarcity framework all the time in relationship to work, but also to creativity. It's inherent in the Sermon on the Mount, this idea of why shouldn't we be anxious because of sort of the promise of God to provide, right? If you think about the Israelites in the desert during the Exodus, they wake up in the morning and there's manna on the ground. There's a sense in which it's sort of abundant, but human beings have the capacity to always see the scarcity, right? They can see the end of the manna. They know when it's all been picked up and it's all gone. And it's an act of faith in a sense to say there's going to be more tomorrow, right? But I look at this Bernie Sanders thing, I look at this attitude towards work that sees it, this adversarial thing, and it does seem to me like that's a scarcity mindset that says our time is limited, our days are limited, so we need to carve out as much space as possible for the good, and this narrow definition of the good is more time hunting in the morning, writing poetry in the afternoon, or whatever. In reality, look, it's the 21st century. Like, it's going to be Netflix in the morning and Instagram in the afternoon, God knows what else at night. So I'm not terribly confident it's going to turn us into effectively more productive people. But when we think about work as the thing that we were wired to do, and this idea that we were wired to sort of take this environment that appears scarce and to make something of it, there's such a sense of purpose and opportunity in that. And this gets me to another thing that I started to think about as I was reading the Sanders thing. I just feel like this is a recipe for despair for people who already don't feel like they have a sense of purpose and meaning. Your work isn't important, so we need to do much less of it now. And now we're going to set you loose in the world with the sense that what you were doing with your days wasn't that valuable in the first place. Now you have 8 more hours to contemplate that. How's that going to go especially for young men who are listless and shapeless, things we've talked about offline a bit?
Look, it's not theoretical, Mike. The way you're describing, we have a proof of concept for. If going from 40 or 50 hours a week down to 32 is going to enhance people's peace of mind and quality of life, wouldn't going to 0 really enhance it? And how has that gone? How have we done with this increase of roughly 15% of prime working age men that are out of the workforce? Is the mental health better or worse? Is the depression better or worse? Drug and alcohol abuse better or worse? Idleness is the devil's tool. Why 32? If the argument is because work is imprisoning the soul of mankind and keeping them from these really meaningful and liberating activities, why not go to 10, ultimately 0? And then let's take the principle the other direction. Is Elon Musk going to stop at 32 hours? See, this is the part I have a hard time with my progressive friends that are worried about wealth and income inequality, is I don't think they understand the anthropology behind this. You're not going to stop. The risk takers and entrepreneurs and productive, creative types at 32 hours. They will continue even as we create governmental restrictions on others only being able to work at that 32, and you're going to exacerbate this divide, which is not merely economic or financial, but becomes a social and cultural divide. So I think that we have seen firsthand what voluntary removement from productive work has done to this whole of society, and it has not been good. And ultimately, all this is a marginal move in that direction.
The other thing I thought about as I was reading this story this week was, did you happen to watch The Bear?
Oh, it's my wife's favorite show ever.
So the episode Forks, for people who've seen The Bear, season 2, there's an episode called Forks.
Episode 7.
Yep. Cousin Richie goes to work at the best restaurant in Chicago, and he spends the first third of the episode miserable and angry because he's put to work in this incredible high-end kitchen, just polishing the forks. That's his only job. It's the only thing they'll let him do. And then there's this shift in his mindset in the episode where he realizes why the fork needs to be perfect and how that fits into the whole vision of this restaurant that's serving food and just giving people an experience. And it's one of the most work positive 45 minutes of television I've ever seen in my life.
Mike, I played that episode scene at my team retreat last year at my company. I cried. People in the room were crying. It's one of the most powerful scenes ever, but it's powerful for the very reason you just said, that it illustrated somebody who made some very bad decisions in his life. Richie had a lot of regret. Richie had a lot of guilt that was deserved. He was not a good guy. And in work, he found goodness. He found the ability to be productive. He found redemption from past mistakes he had made to turn something ugly and make it beautiful. And in that little minuscule analogy, we found gospel. I thought it was absolutely beautiful, and it really does mirror what I believe about work, that we have a chance to redeem things, to make certain things that are what they are, something bigger and better. And from polishing forks to becoming, a meaningful part of a beautiful, wonderful restaurant experience, there's story there, but that's really the story of so much of our human labor is us taking something small and making it big. And that is what I think God ordained us to do in Genesis chapter 1.
Yeah. Before I let you go, David, I do have to ask, because I think it's something that listeners and potential readers will notice in very much the same way that I did. You only have 2 endorsements on the book. One is John Tyson. John's a pastor in New York. I believe John's written some for CT. People will probably be familiar with him. And then the other one is Doug Wilson, a often controversial figure, someone who has been mentioned in CT recently as a controversial figure. There's a bit of a contrast there. And I know that'll be a question for potential readers and listeners. I'd love for you to talk about why those two.
It's interesting because it is a contrast in the state of current evangelicalism, and yet in my life, it's very compatible. John Tyson is my pastor in New York City, and he is charismatic. I am not. He is very Kuyperian, worldview-minded Christian, which I am, and so is Doug Wilson. They have a lot of differences. But in a sense, me picking those 2 people, I also had endorsements from Dana Perino and Ben Shapiro and other folks that are maybe more Fox News famous, and I picked 2 evangelical people. The contrast is in a way a reflection of my own belief right now about navigating relationships in the current church. I make a conscious decision every day of my life. I'm forced to do this and redo it every day these days. It's not always fun for me to focus on the common ground and areas of agreement instead of the disconnect in areas of disagreement, particularly in those areas where I know they're irresolvable. There's just certain elements where we're not going to get someone else to agree, but they have so much to offer on a particular subject. I don't agree with everything Doug Wilson has said or done, but I have a relationship with Doug, and I'm able to talk to him about those things. There's other people in evangelical Christianity that I don't have a relationship with, and I haven't had the chance to engage them personally on certain things, so I choose not to really go after it publicly as much. That's just a decision I've made because I'm a byproduct of my own upbringing and experience. I'm going to turn 50 years old next month, and I've spent my whole Christian life watching Christians fight, and I'm completely exhausted by it. And so I've just chosen to focus on areas of agreement and common ground. Both John Tyson and Doug Wilson have things I disagree with, but both of them have abundant things I agree with. And that was sort of the decision there to focus on where the area of agreement is, which in this case, the book they're endorsing is a theology of work. They each have an audience that I think needs to hear it, but it's a different audience and it's a different reason, and yet coming from this theological common ground. Where there's a chance for civil and charitable discourse where there's areas of disagreement, I'm all for it. But right now, I think we're living in a time where most people seem, especially in online Christianity, seem to wake up every day trying to find who they can disagree with. And I am just totally exhausted by that.
When I saw that, part of what encouraged me about it was this sense that finding some of these common ground places for conversations has to be the place where those other harder conversations could eventually happen. Like if we can't maintain some connectivity, how can we ever have the harder conversations down the line? David Bahnsen, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. The book is called Full Time. Encourage people to check it out. We'll see you all next week here at The Bulletin. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's executive produced by Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper. It's produced by Clarissa Mall and Matt Stevens. Post-production by TJ Hester. Our art for this episode is by Rick Shooks. Music by Dan Phelps. And social media by Kate Lucky. Thanks for listening.